The Simpsons is one of the most analyzed shows in television history, from various fan theories scattered across the internet to academic studies in the fields of sociology, philosophy, and linguistics. Yet, there's one significant episode from the so-called golden era of the series that has been completely overlooked, and its true meaning has been missed by even the most die-hard Simpsons fans. I am speaking of the 23rd episode of the 7th season of the show, an episode titled Much Apu About Nothing, which first aired on the Fox network on May 5th, 1996. It is arguably one of the most politically salient storylines of the entire series as it centers around the topic of immigration. But what fans have missed is the fact that Much Apu About Nothing is based on a real election that took place in California in 1994. As confirmed by the show creators, the episode is based on a statewide ballot initiative called Proposition 187, which aimed to deprive undocumented immigrants of public services, as the writers of the show stated in the director's commentary in the DVD version of the episode.
Yeah, of course, for those of you who don't follow California politics, which I assume is almost all of you, this was based on Proposition 187, which at the time was a popular ballot measure in California, which was basically going to say that if passed, all illegal immigrants and their children would be deprived of medical care, even in an emergency situation, and education, which obviously had a lot of controversy about it. So this was the same thing. Of course, Springfield, for some reason, which is only a city, has the power to deport people and a number of other unrealistic things. But, you know, what the hell? It's a cartoon.
In retrospect, the vote on Prop 187 was one of the most consequential American elections of the entire 1990s, as it foreshadowed the success of Donald Trump and the accompanying rise of xenophobia in the United States. Thus, with The Simpsons faithfully mirroring the pivotal 1994 election, Much Apu About Nothing is worth analyzing for its historical relevance. For those who have never seen the episode, here's a very quick recap. Much Apu About Nothing centers around a beloved side character named Apu Nahasapina Petalan, an undocumented immigrant of Indian descent who is distressed that he might get deported. At the beginning of the story, Springfield's mayor, Quimby, finds himself embattled with the town's residents who are complaining about their high taxes, necessitated humorously by exuberant spending on military-grade bear patrols. Faced with a constituency that insists on the bear patrols yet scruples at the cost, the erratic Mayor Quimby proclaims that the real reason why taxes are high is, quote-unquote, because of illegal immigrants. He then introduces a ballot initiative called Proposition 24, which, if passed, would result in the deportation of all undocumented immigrants in Springfield, including the character Apu, who becomes the central focus of the episode. One difference between Prop 24 in The Simpsons and its real-life counterpart is that Prop 187 sought to deny all undocumented residents access to public services, including public education. This means that if it had been enacted into law, undocumented children would have been punished by getting kicked out of school. But the cruelty was the point, as the Republican governor of California, Pete Wilson, who backed the measure, stated, "If it's clear to you that you cannot be employed and that you and your family are ineligible for services, you will self-deport." Many voters were convinced by Governor Wilson's argument, and so, Prop 187, the inhumane ballot initiative that would have harmed hundreds of thousands of children, ended up passing in liberal California with a resounding 58% of the vote.
It passed, and I remember Pete Wilson, the governor, the first thing he said after the election, he said, "We're going to deny prenatal services to illegal immigrants."
Proposition 187 was so extreme and went far beyond the state of California's legal jurisdiction that it was quickly ruled unconstitutional by the courts. So luckily, it was never enacted into law. Nevertheless, the fact that the Save Our State initiative was so overwhelmingly popular even in liberal California, it incentivized both major political parties to take a hardline stance against immigration. President Clinton would go on to sign anti-immigration legislation and enact measures that became the foundation for the punitive deportation we now witness under President Donald Trump. Thus, even if Prop 187 was not enforced, the impact of the 1994 referendum is still felt to this day. While the Save Our State initiative had popular support, the writers for The Simpsons, who lived in California, understood its absurdity. In Much Apu About Nothing, they sought to expose some of the faulty logic that held sway with the anti-immigration crowd at the time. For example, in one scene, Lisa Simpson asks her father why he supports Prop 24, to which Homer responds by saying, "Open your eyes, Lisa. Our schools are so jam-packed with immigrants, kids like Bart have lost the will to learn." Of course, viewers of the show understand that Bart's lack of scholastic ambition has nothing to do with immigrants, but as absurd as the argument sounds coming from Homer, the Simpsons writers were actually referencing one of the real arguments made by the supporters of Proposition 187. We see it in the words of Governor Pete Wilson of California, who was running for re-election at the time. Among his reasons for supporting Prop 187, Wilson blamed the decline in education standards to the presence of undocumented children in schools. Writing in the Los Angeles Times a few months before the '94 race, Wilson stated, "The outrage in education today is that, despite already overcrowding classrooms and too tight budgets, there are 400,000 illegal immigrants enrolled in California's public schools. Our schools and our kids will have a greater future if we have the courage to make fundamental change, including illegal immigration reform." When Homer blames immigrant children for the decline in education, our response is laughter. But when Governor Pete Wilson made essentially the same faulty argument, voters in his state were convinced. Of course, a decline in educational standards was not the only issue driving anti-immigrant sentiment in California. As the Simpsons episode also points out, many of those who opposed immigration were also driven by nativist tendencies. In one hilarious scene in Much Apu About Nothing, Homer's friend and local bartender Moe makes protest signs in favor of Proposition 24. As he slaps crudely formed letters on a sign, he complains, "You know what really aggravates me? Them immigrants. They want all the benefits of living in Springfield, but they ain't even bothered to learn themselves the language." To which Homer responds, "Yeah, those are exactly my sentimonies." Of course, the joke is that these characters are completely oblivious to their substandard use of their own language. Interestingly, Moe's anger at immigrants for not speaking English mirrors some of the primary motivations behind those who spearheaded California's Proposition 187. The leader of the Save Our State initiative and founder of the group that sponsored the proposition, a group called California Coalition for Immigration Reform, was a woman named Barbara Coe. Coe was pivotal in the passage of the referendum, and in one interview at the time, she recalled the exact moment in her life when she realized that immigration was a problem. Barbara Coe told a journalist that her wake-up call came when she once walked through a public service center in Orange County and was made uncomfortable by the presence of so many people speaking Spanish and Vietnamese. "I walked into this monstrous room full of people, babies and little children all over the place, and I realized nobody was speaking English," she said. "There was every language under the sun being spoken, and I'm going, where am I? What's happened here?" In other words, it was not because she had lost her job to a migrant, or was a victim of a crime committed by a migrant that led Barbara Coe to oppose immigration. Rather, she was initially motivated by the sight of too many non-English speaking brown people. This apparently traumatic event led Barbara Coe to become one of the main architects of Proposition 187. While the main activists behind the Save Our State initiative were driven by racism, it would not be entirely fair to say that everyone who voted for the referendum was racist. Yes, a solid majority of whites in California voted yes on Prop 187, but so did almost half of Black and Asian Americans, as well as a quarter of Latinos. Across class lines, the vote share was similar as well. In addition to concerns for students and likely racist sentiments, many Californians, like their counterparts in The Simpsons, believed that immigration was the source of their economic hardships. As The Simpsons episode also demonstrates, voters can easily become deceived into believing in this myth when served up by their political leaders. In Much Apu About Nothing, it is made clear that Quimby, the mayor of Springfield, is the one who incites the anti-immigrant fervor. Taxes are seemingly high because the mayor spends ludicrous amounts of money on the so-called Bear Patrol, which even appears to include the use of a stealth fighter jet to patrol the skies over Springfield. There's nothing in the episode that indicates that undocumented immigrants like Apu are responsible for Springfield's economic problems. And the initial suggestion that immigrants are to blame comes when Quimby is trying to quell the anger of his unreasonable constituents, who insist on the Bear Patrols but don't want to pay for them. In the Simpsons version of things, the immigration crisis is cited primarily as a means to divert attention from other problems. Mayor Quimby, rather than offering real solutions, simply scapegoats immigrants to keep the townspeople from blaming him for their high taxes. It is worth pausing for a moment to consider the character Mayor Quimby. With an exaggerated Bostonian accent and a promiscuous lifestyle, Quimby is widely recognized as a parody of a Kennedy, and in other episodes, he is also identified as a Democrat. by presenting Quimby as the one to fabricate and introduce the immigration crisis. The Simpsons writers are again in lockstep with what was happening in the real world. However, rather than acting like a Kennedy, in this case, Quimby more closely resembles another Democrat, namely President Bill Clinton, who in 1994 similarly blamed immigrants the way Quimby did for his economic failures. In the same year, Californians would vote on Proposition 187, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, went into effect between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. NAFTA hurt American workers who suffered from job losses and stagnant wages. But the trade agreement also devastated the economy of the US's southern neighbor. Unable to compete with US subsidized goods that soon flooded the Mexican market, millions of Mexicans became unemployed, poverty rates skyrocketed, and the value of the peso dropped by half. Border crossings skyrocketed as a result of Mexicans losing their livelihood thanks to Clinton's disastrous free trade agreement. Migrants sought a better life as NAFTA shattered their prospects back in their native country. But rather than taking responsibility for what he did to the economy in the US and Mexico, the Quimby-esque President Clinton scapegoated immigrants and sought to demonstrate that he was standing up for the American working class by being tough on the border. Just 1 month before Californians would vote for Proposition 187, the Clinton administration launched Operation Gatekeeper to crack down on border crossings in the San Diego area. It was a complete publicity stunt that did nothing to actually stop migration, and the number of Mexican-born immigrants would continue to grow into the 2000s. If Operation Gatekeeper had any lasting effect, it was to force immigrants from Mexico to cross the border through more dangerous terrain, such as deserts or mountains. 4 years later, US authorities would discover and record 145 dead migrants, whose cause of death ranged from hypothermia, heat stroke, to drowning. Mayor Quimby's desperate attempt to deflect blame for his own incompetence can be seen as a parallel to Clinton's political maneuverings. But Clinton was not the only Democrat to help popularize the false idea that immigrants were the ones to blame for the poor state of the economy. The Democratic Party in California was also responsible for normalizing xenophobia. In the 1994 election, the Democrats' official stance was one of opposition to Prop 187, but it must be pointed out that this opposition was not because the ballot initiative was seen as cruel or racist. On the contrary, the Democrats maintained that the proposition did not go far enough. The main liberal opposition, called Taxpayers Against 187, ran under the slogan, "Illegal immigration is a real problem, but Proposition 187 is not a real solution." And they argued that if undocumented children were kicked out of schools, they would simply become violent criminals. Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein of California boasted at the time that she led the fight to stop illegal immigration before Pete Wilson did. According to the Los Angeles Times, it was actually Feinstein who inspired Wilson to become more aggressive against immigration, and that she provided cover for politicians of both parties, lending respectability to a sensitive area where it is easy to be branded a demagogue and a bigot. Kathleen Brown, the Democratic candidate for governor who was running against Pete Wilson in the same election that year, charged that it was the incumbent Republican governor who was actually weak on immigration, saying, "He cut a hole in the fence to allow millions of illegal immigrants in, and now he wants to patch that hole because that's what the polls tell him to do." Of course, the Democrats' campaign strategy of playing both sides by opposing Prop 187 and at the same time trying to sound more anti-immigrant than the Republicans did not work. Not only did the Save Our State initiative pass, but Kathleen Brown lost in her bid for governor despite Pete Wilson's flagging popularity with voters. Just a year before the election, one poll gave his performance only a 31% approval rating among Californian voters. Unfortunately, Democrats today have learned nothing from their loss in an otherwise easily winnable election of '94. They continue to repeat the same losing strategy of trying to outdo the Republicans when it comes to the issue of immigration. In the 2024 presidential race, Kamala Harris, another California Democrat, made her stance on immigration one of the central arguments against Donald Trump. She claimed that she, and not Trump, was in fact tougher on the border. Barely any voters were convinced by this argument, and so, by adopting the xenophobic rhetoric of the Republicans, the Democrats fumbled once again in an easily winnable election. It was bad enough to lose against Pete Wilson with a dismal 31% approval rating, but it was even a bigger failure to lose to a convicted felon. Could Kamala Harris have won if she had been pro-immigration? Certainly there were many other factors for her loss, and I made a whole video on that very topic. But yes, I do believe a pro-immigration position could have helped Harris if she had framed the issue in humanistic terms. If we revisit the polls during the 2024 presidential race, most voters believe that Trump would do a better job at handling immigration than Harris. This may seem like a popular mandate for the Republican president to strengthen border enforcement and mobilize ICE agents against undocumented immigrants. But as I'm recording this in August 2025, in recent months, Trump's approval rating on his immigration policies has dropped from net positive to net disapproval. Even prominent figures who endorsed Trump in 2024, such as the popular podcaster Joe Rogan, have recently called the president's deportation of migrant workers as horrific. We can theorize that, during election seasons, voters can easily be manipulated into believing that immigrants are bad for the economy when politicians like Trump and even Harris run on this pretext. But once anti-immigration policies get enforced and draconian ICE agents are unleashed to root out undocumented immigrants, Americans realize that it will not just be criminals or gang members who are going to be kicked out of the country, it will also be their friends and neighbors. Once the human cost of xenophobia and the deportation machine becomes a reality, the public often changes its mind. This is one of the key points that the Simpsons make in much Apu About Nothing. In the first act of the episode, Homer is initially swept up by the anti-immigrant fervor that sweeps through Springfield, and he becomes a vocal proponent of Proposition 24. But in the second act, he becomes vehemently opposed to the ballot initiative when he realizes that Apu is undocumented. When he sees his friend in tears over fears of being kicked out of the country he grew to love, Homer comes face to face with the potential human consequences of deporting immigrants, and he has a change of heart. What Democrats should have done in the 1994 election in California, as well as in the 2024 presidential race, was to not join the anti-immigrant bandwagon. Rather, they should have honestly reminded voters of the human toll of unleashing a deportation machine. The risk that such a strategy would end up going after innocent undocumented members of our society, many of whom we may know and love, should have been presented front and center. Instead of trying to outflank the Republicans by trying to sound even more xenophobic, the Democrats would have performed better by appealing to the better angels of our nature. They could even have won a demographic that usually leans Republican, like white middle-class Americans, the Homer Simpson vote, by reminding them that they, too, may have a friend and neighbor like Apu. Many Simpsons fans like to point out how the show predicted Donald Trump becoming president, which is sort of true. In one joke in an episode from the 11th season that aired in the year 2000, Lisa refers to Trump being president in the future. But the more important episode that explained the nativist causes that propelled a demagogue like Trump was actually in the 7th season of an episode about Apu, which not only gives us a history lesson of the forgotten story of Proposition 187, but also a reminder of how to combat racism that seeks to dehumanize immigrants. Perhaps those who seek to oppose Trump today can even borrow some talking points from Homer Simpson. As he states in the end of the episode, if the country kicks people out like Apu, we will be losing some of the truest Americans of all.